Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for logging in. We'll take just a few seconds and let everybody have time to log into the webinar today. We're expecting 70 attendees, so we're really excited. So give us just a few seconds here. Good afternoon. If I've missed you, we'll give it just a few seconds before we get started. Hold on, we'll get started. Got a few more to go here. Okay, wonderful. Well, good afternoon. I'm Mary Landers, and for those of you that don't know me, I have the privilege of serving as the alumni director at UNCG, and I want to welcome you to our first Vanguard virtual series in 2022. We're so glad to bring everyone back together with a kickoff for the new year, and I'm especially pleased to be joining you today in our beautiful Pecky Cypress room. I'm sure many of you will recognize the room in the background, and I hope it makes you feel at home. Most of you are familiar with our Vanguard format, but for those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me share just a few highlights of our session today. Because of the considerable number of attendees, this will be an online seminar format, meaning that you will not be able to see the other attendees. Your questions and participation are so important to us and an important part of the discussion. So please feel free to raise your hand using the raise your hand icon, or feel free to put something in the chat. We will be able to unmute you and bring you into the conversation. We do encourage you to ask questions, so please know that we will open the chat room as soon as the presentation is completed. So without further delay, I'm so pleased to introduce our guest presenter for our session today. Dr. Jeffrey Kaplan is an assistant professor at UNCG with his specialization in philosophy of law and philosophy of language. Before coming to UNCG, Dr. Kaplan received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He spent 4 years teaching philosophy at San Quentin State Prison. Adding to his educational curriculum, Dr. Kaplan received his MPhil at the University of Cambridge and was an undergraduate at Williams College and the University of Oxford. Adding to all these very distinctive accolades, Dr. Kaplan has become a YouTube superstar. 2 years ago, to support his own online courses, he began creating online videos, and to his delight, they have received more than 500,000 views and 84,700 hours of watch time. And something tells me that's probably grown since the new semester has started. Dr. Kaplan commented on his online success by stating that some people come to these videos out of curiosity, but then I discovered that there's a big percentage of people who watch these videos because they're in law school and can't understand their professors. So Jeff, we are thrilled that you're here today to kind of help us better understand philosophy and this topic of interest. And we just cannot wait to feel like we're back in the classroom again. So what a special treat for all of us.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, and I'll just tell you before I do that what I'm going to do today, which is I'm going to give the talk. I'm going to give the lecture that I give on the first day of class for all of my philosophy courses. This is well, here, I'll share my screen right now. The topic is what is philosophy, and you're going to get the same talk that I give to the students at UNCG at the beginning of every semester. So here we go. Okay. We're trying to figure out what philosophy is. It helps to start with some philosophical questions, some examples. These are the kinds of questions that we talk about in a college level philosophy course. Does God exist? How do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? Do I have free will? Which actions are morally good and which actions are morally bad? What is the just, that is the fair way to arrange society? Does life have a meaning or a purpose? Do I have a soul or something like that that lives on after my bodily death? We can actually talk about some of these specific questions if you like. I'll go through the talk, and then with however much time we have left at the end, we can talk about anything that I say today, including any of these things, or really anything else. Okay, so these are questions that are not exclusively discussed by philosophy professors. They're also questions that are of interest, particularly to children. Here's an example. I have a 6-year-old son. This happened maybe a year and a half ago. We were brushing his teeth. We're in the bathroom, and he's stalling because it's bedtime and he wants everything to go slow so that he can stay up longer. We're in the bathroom, and he asks the following question about the tiles on the bathroom floor. He asks, this isn't in my notes, so I'm just trying to remember the story. He asks something like, is the floor white with black circles, or is it black with white stars, or whatever, right? That was his question about the design on the tiles on our bathroom floor. Okay, this is a question in what we call metaphysics. Metaphysics is a subfield of philosophy, and it studies, the most fundamental nature of reality or something, what there really is. And so his question was, what color is the floor really? Is it really white with some black on it, or is it really black with some white on it? And so then I said to him, oh, that's a great question. It could be either way, or it could be, I said, it could be that the floor doesn't have one color and not the other. It's just that there are white stars and there are black circles, and that's it. That's all there is to say. It's not that one of the colors, is a more fundamental part of the floor than the other. And then he said, oh no, I think it's white with black circles. Anyway, so what distinguishes the children who think about these questions from academic philosophers like myself and my colleagues in the philosophy department is just that we continue doing it. We keep thinking about these questions, and we try to answer them, not in a sort of fun, casual way, but in a less fun, rigorous way. Okay, but here's the thing. Examples are nice. It's nice to have examples. But it would be nice if instead we could say something, and I'll ask the audience a question in just a second. It would be nice if instead we could say something about what unifies these questions. Like, what do you think all of these questions have in common? What do they have in common that groups them together, that makes them philosophical questions, and makes all of the other questions that we could ask, all the questions that you'd ask in a biology classroom or a history classroom, what makes those questions different? What makes those not philosophical questions? So, okay, this is a sincere question, and I'm asking it to the audience. I guess you could answer in the chat. What unifies these questions? What do you think all of these questions have in common? Let's see. Is someone going to type an answer or unmute themselves? I don't know what's possible.
Nothing in the chat yet, Jeff.
All right. Well, I'll wait a second, and then I'll just tell you what answer people were going to give if I don't get an answer.
What Alice says, what is the purpose of being?
Yeah, good. That's very similar. That's a philosophical question, no doubt. And it's very similar to this one closer to the bottom, like, does life have a meaning or a purpose? And the question is, here's the thing, folks. Here's what I'm asking. Here's another way to phrase my question. This question down here, does life have a meaning or a purpose? Or Alice's question, what is the purpose of being? What is our purpose for living or existing? Those questions, those don't on the surface seem obviously similar to, how do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? Or does God exist? These seem like kind of different sorts of questions. Yeah, good, from Lee. What these questions have in common is that there are no clear-cut answers. They can be answered in multiple ways. Yes, I would say that is the most tempting natural answer. In fact, it's so tempting that I've already put it on the slides, right? Before they can be answered. Yeah, okay, so Marcia says, before any of these can be answered, you must decide your method for finding an answer. Yeah, that's good. That's really my answer, Marcia. So don't steal my answer. Hold on a few seconds, and I'll be saying that. Good. So excellent. So here's the thing. Consider the idea that what these questions have in common is that there are no answers that apply to everyone, that they are in some sense subjective. They could be answered in multiple ways, as Lee said in the chat. Well, this I think is a very natural thought. There are lots of questions that are subjective in this sense, right? There are questions that there is no one answer that's right for everyone. Like, here's an example of a question like that. Are pickles tasty? Okay, well, some people will say, yes, they're tasty. And some people will say, no, they're not tasty. And here's the thing. Everyone's right. The people who like pickles and say that pickles are tasty, they're right. Pickles are tasty for them. And the people who don't like pickles and they say, no, pickles are not tasty, they're right too, because pickles aren't tasty for them. Like, tastiness, matters of taste, really and truly are subjective. There is no, fact independent of someone's personal preferences. There is no fact about whether some type of food is tasty or not. So there are matters that are truly subjective in this sense. And the question is, are all of these questions here, these philosophical questions, are they subjective? And is that what unifies the philosophical questions? I would like to suggest that none of these questions are subjective. They're difficult to answer, of course. And people disagree about what the answers are. And it's hard to convince people of what the answers are. But I don't think any of these questions are subjective. I think these questions have a one right answer that's right for everyone. Take, for example, the first question here, does God exist, right? This is a question, although loftier, is similar to the kind of question you'd ask about whether anything exists, right? You want to know whether Bigfoot exists. Okay, if you want to know whether Bigfoot exists, well, then what do? First thing you do is you define what you mean by Bigfoot. Oh, by Bigfoot, I mean a creature that's this tall and has a lot of hair and is on the evolutionary chart, falls between human beings and other primates and this and that, right? You define what you're talking about, and then you go and try to figure out if that thing exists. And here's the thing. Whether or not we can figure out the answer to the question, does Bigfoot exist? I mean, I think the answer is no, Bigfoot doesn't exist. But no matter how difficult it is to figure out the answer, and no matter how many people disagree with one another about what the answer is, there is just one answer. Either Bigfoot exists or not. It's not like up to your personal preference. Bigfoot's existence is determined not by what people think about it, but entirely by whether or not a creature that meets those criteria walks through the woods, right? Is really there. I suggest that the question, does God exist, is similar, right? When philosophers of religion try to answer this question, they first define what they're talking about. They have a definition. They come up with a definition of what they mean by the word God. And if they can't agree on a definition of what they mean by the word God, well, then they just have different words that, you'll say God 1 and God 2. We'll just have a bunch of different words for all the different things we could be referring to, right? All the different types of being. And then it just becomes a question of whether this thing exists or not. And it's a very difficult question. But even though it's a difficult question, either this being exists or it doesn't. And I suggest that that's true of all these questions. I think none of them are subjective. Okay, we can come back to that. But anyway, in the meantime, we still have this question, what is philosophy? That is, what unifies all of those philosophical questions and makes them philosophical questions? Okay, well, here's my answer. I'm just going to give you the answer. That's the talk. This is how the talk goes, is I give the answer. Here goes. Here's my answer. This is it. It's a big chart. And now I'm going to walk you through it. Okay, so we've got these questions. Well, and we've got the questions that I listed earlier, and we've also just got any question that you could possibly ask. And what I'm doing in this little diagram is I'm categorizing different types of questions. So look up at the top in the middle here. You've got a question, and ask of that question, can it be answered with observation and experimentation? Some questions can be answered with observation and experimentation, right? If the answer is yes, if a question can be answered with observation and experimentation, the technical term is that question is empirical. It's an empirical question. You don't need to remember the term empirical. You may be familiar with it already or not, but all of the questions in physics and biology and chemistry and economics and history and sociology, almost every subject at the university, though not all, they traffic in empirical questions. They fall over here. So here's a very simple example. Chickens. Here's a question about chickens. I'll ask the question and then I'll give you the answer because I assume all of you already know the answer. But the question about chickens is this. Do chickens give birth to live young or do they lay eggs? The answer is chickens lay eggs. Okay. How do we know that answer? How did we answer that question about whether chickens give birth to live young or whether they lay eggs? Well, we answer that question through observation. We observed. What we did as a species to figure out how chickens work is we sat a chicken down. Someone did it. You could have done it today, or you could just trust other people who've done it. You sit the chicken down and you look, you watch, you sit there and you watch, and eventually something's going to fall out, right? That's how we know that chickens lay eggs. And that's how we know the answers to all the questions in physics and biology and chemistry. And that's how we know the answers to all of the questions in economics and psychology and anthropology, right? We observe things. And of course, experimentation, running an experiment is really just a subclass of observation, right? When you experiment, you set up an artificial scenario, an experiment, right? And then you observe, you look, you watch, you use your senses to tell what happens, right? So all these questions are empirical. They're questions that can be answered with observation or experimentation. The examples I have up here on the slides are a question from physics: what gives particles their mass? Well, the way physicists try to figure that out is they run experiments. They like shoot lasers into things, I gather, and they watch, they observe what happens when they shoot the lasers. What causes inflation? That's a question in economics, right? Economists look at the data. They observe what happens in the economy. That's how they figure out what causes inflation. Okay, those are the empirical questions. That's one category of questions. But there's another possibility, that is, there are some questions, the answer to this question about them is no, right? They cannot be answered with observation or experimentation. Let me give you an example of a question like that, okay? A question that's a real question that cannot be answered by observing things in the world. Okay, take a look at this. This is not the number 2. This is a numeral that represents the number 2. This is an Arabic numeral, they're called. The numerals of this kind are just symbols that represent numbers. We have numerals, you're familiar, I'm sure, with all the numerals that go up to, 9 and beyond. We've got all these numerals. The numerals are just symbols. They're not numbers themselves, right? So think about a property of the number 2, for example. The number 2 is, I don't know, the number 2 is the square root of 4. That's true, right? The square root of 4 is 2, I think. I'm not a math professor, but I think the square root of 4 is 2, right? That's a property of the number 2. That's not a property of the numeral. The symbol, the bits of ink on a piece of paper, or the bits of the pixels on your screen in front of you, the pixels, the ink, the symbol, none of those things are the square root of 4. I mean, none of those things have any of the properties of the number 2. Another property of the number 2 is the number 2 is even. It's evenly divisible by 2. Well, that's true. But the numeral, that is the symbol, isn't evenly divisible by 2. How would you divide it by 2? You like chop it in half sideways? That's not what we mean when we talk about mathematical division, right? The number 2 and the numeral are very different. The numeral, the symbol, is something you can see, but the number is something no one has ever seen, because the number doesn't exist. I mean, at least it doesn't exist in the world that we live in. No one's ever seen the number 2, right? Not only do we have this Arabic numeral that represents the number 2, we also have the other one, these other numerals that come from Italy. They're called Roman numerals, and they look, the Roman numeral for the number 2 is 2 eyes next to one another, right? That's a different numeral. It's just a different symbol. It represents the same thing, the number 2. Here's the thing. You can observe numerals, but you can never observe numbers. So whatever we know about numbers, we don't know through observation or experimentation, right? Because you can't observe a number. A number is not a thing that you can observe. So mathematical questions, a question like, what's the square root of 4? We know the answer to that question. The answer is 2. But we don't know that answer by way of observation or experimentation because you can't observe numbers. No one has ever observed numbers. So however it is that we figured out the answer to the question, what's the square root of 4? We didn't do it empirically. We didn't do it by observation. Here's another example. This on your screen right now is not, I mean, none of this that I'm saying is controversial, okay? This is just uncontroversial, universally accepted fact or whatever, but this on your screen is not a triangle. This is a bunch of pixels on a computer screen, right? And if I were to be in a physical classroom and draw this on the chalkboard, it wouldn't be a triangle either. What you can't draw literally, you can't literally draw a triangle. A triangle is a 2-dimensional figure. It's a 3-sided enclosed polygon. That's what the mathematicians tell me, right? It's a 2-dimensional figure, but what you can draw on a chalkboard is a bunch of dots of chalk. And the chalk dots, the bits of chalk, the particles of chalk, they are not 2-dimensional, they're 3-dimensional. They're particles of chalk. They're made of molecules. They're made of atoms, right? And those atoms are 3-dimensional. They have a height and a width and a depth. That's 3 dimensions. They're in the 3-dimensional physical world that we live in. And so we know things about triangles, just like we know things about the number 2, but we've never seen a triangle because triangles don't exist, at least not in our world, right? All we have are drawings of triangles. And the drawings, of course, are just symbols that represent the idea of a triangle, right? Everything you've ever seen has been 3-dimensional. Everything, right? You could even look, for example, at the side of a building. Imagine there's a side of a building and it's triangular in shape, right? There's no triangles there. That's just the side of a building. The shape of the side of a building resembles a triangle, but a triangle is a 2-dimensional figure. And everything that you can see, including the building and all the little pieces of wood or brick that the building is made up out of, everything that you can see is 3-dimensional. So whatever a triangle is, you can't see it. No one's ever seen a triangle. No one. And no one, I suggest, ever will see a triangle because triangles are imaginary 2-dimensional objects. And there are no 2-dimensional objects. Every object is 3-dimensional. I mean, go look around whatever room you're in. I'm in my office on campus at UNCG, and here's my mug, and it's 3-dimensional. It has a height and a width and a depth, and inside of it is some water. The water is made up entirely out of molecules. The molecules are all 3-dimensional. There's just nothing in my office that's 2-dimensional. Not even a piece of paper, of course, because a piece of paper, even though it's kind of thin, it really is 3-dimensional. Okay, what's my point? My point is numbers, triangles, these things cannot be observed. So we know facts about them, but we know those facts not by way of observation or experimentation, but by some other method, right? We know the fact, if you look at the corners of this triangle, the interior corners sum to 180 degrees. That's a fact about triangles, right? If you add up the size of all the angles, there we go, that was the word I was searching for, angles. If you add up all the interior angles, they sum, the sum of them is 180. Okay, that's a fact about triangles. And if you're talking to someone and they think that the sum of the interior angles of a triangle is 175, they're just wrong. There is an answer to this question, and the answer is 180 degrees. But we don't know that through observation or experimentation. These questions are non-empirical. Okay, but they can be answered another way. That's why math is down here, right in the middle, in the bottom middle of this chart. These questions are answered, right? They're answers, they're proven from stipulated definitions and axioms. That's how math works, right? You stipulate the definitions. Stipulate just means make it up, right? We just made up the definition of the number 2. We said, oh, it's the number that comes after 1. We just made it up. No one ever saw the number 2. We didn't discover the number 2 the way that we discovered chickens. And we didn't discover triangles the way that we discovered chickens, right? We just made up the ideas of these things. So we made up some definitions. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with making up definitions. We made up the definitions of some imaginary objects. And then we also made up what are called axioms. Axioms are just other made up claims, other stipulated claims. You know, like in Euclidean geometry, maybe there's an axiom that 2 parallel lines never converge or something. I don't know, right? That's another claim. That's not a definition, but it's a stipulated claim. Stipulated meaning made up, assumed, just granted without proving it in any way. Okay, that's how mathematics works, right? We make up the ideas for these objects, these numbers or whatever, and then we stipulate some definitions, and then we run some proofs, some calculations, if you will. That's how we get the answers to mathematical questions, right? That's why math falls down here in the middle, right? So you have questions that can be answered with observation or experimentation. Those are the questions of physics, economics, history, and so forth. Then you have the questions that can be answered by proof from stipulated definitions and axioms. Those are the mathematical questions. But then you have on the lower right here, the leftover questions. These are the questions that can't be answered by either method. You can't figure out the answer to these questions by looking, by observing, and you can't figure out the answer to these questions by running some calculations, by like making up some ideas and running a proof or a calculation. These lingering questions, does God exist? Which actions are morally right? Which actions are morally wrong? And all of the questions that I put up on the slides at the very beginning, the philosophical questions, those are the ones that are left over. So that's my answer. My answer as to what philosophy is philosophy, I think I have it written down, here it is. Philosophy is the project of rigorously answering questions that cannot be answered by A, observation or experimentation, or by B, proof from stipulated definitions or axioms. That's what all of those philosophical questions have in common, is that they cannot be answered by either of these two methods. They're the leftover questions. Okay, so that's my answer. I have a few more things to say, and then I'll be done, and then we can talk. You can ask questions. All right, let's do this. Let's test my answer, this account of what philosophy is, against one of the philosophical questions from before that I put up earlier. Take this question. What is the just, that is the fair way to arrange society? Notice something about this question. How ought society be arranged? How should it be arranged? What's a fair way to arrange society? And by arrange society, I mean, who gets to be the governor, and who gets to be rich and who has to be poor, who gets to live in which houses, that sort of thing. Arrange society. Who gets to be the president of the Rotary Club, or I don't know if they're called the president, but the boss of the Rotary Club or whatever, right? What is the just or fair way of arranging society? This is a philosophical question. Notice something about this question. This is a question of justification. This is asking why should society be a certain way, or whether it should be a certain way. This is not a question of description. We're not trying to describe society when we answer this question. If it was a question of description, the question would be, how is society arranged? And then that question would be empirical, right? That's a question we would answer by observation. Like that's what sociologists do. They want to tell you, the question they're trying to answer, one of them, is how is society arranged? And they try to describe how society is arranged. And the way that they do that, of course, is through observing society, right? But that's not this question. This question that we're asking here, what is the just or fair way to arrange society? We're not asking, how is society arranged? So we're not asking a question of description, nor are we asking a question of prediction. We're not trying to predict how society will be arranged in the future. That's very hard. Various types of folks try to do that, right? Economists kind of sometimes try to do this, right? They try to predict how society will be arranged in the future. Political scientists try to do that. They try sometimes, when they're being bold, they try to predict whether there'll be a revolution in some country or something like that, right? Based on certain factors. And so that's a different question than the one we're trying to answer. If we were asking that question, how will society be arranged in the future? That question also, although hard to answer, that's empirical. You answer that question by observing. You observe how societies change over time, and you try to predict how one particular one is going to change in the future, right? That's not the question we're asking. And also there's this other question, a question of explanation, right? That's the question of why is society arranged this way? Why is society arranged the way that it's currently arranged? That is a historical question. And that question too, that's also empirical, answered by observation. How do historians figure out why society is arranged the way it is? Well, they look at documents and they look at records. They observe, and they look at how things were arranged in the past, and they piece together the puzzle to figure out how we got to where we are now, right? Those are all empirical matters that are investigated by way of observation. But the question that I'm talking about right here, it's not any of those. It's not a question of description. It's not a question of prediction. It's not a question of explanation. It's a question of justification. It's a question about how things ought to be. And once you realize that, you realize, oh, we're never going to answer this question by just looking at how things are. We want to know how they should be. We're never going to know how things should be by merely looking at how they are. Okay, so I suggest that this question cannot be answered empirically, can't be answered by observation or experimentation. And it also can't be answered in the way that mathematical questions are, by just making up some definitions and running some calculations. Like, we made up the idea of a triangle, but we didn't make up the idea of society. We discovered society. Society was just there. It consists of human beings and their actions, of course, right? But it's just out there, whether we imagined it or not. Whether we think about society or not, society's out there happening, right? So society is a real thing in the physical world. It's not some imagined stipulated thing that we can run some calculations on, like we do in mathematics. So this question can neither be answered by observation or experimentation, nor can it be answered by proof from stipulated definitions or axioms. And so for that reason, it's a philosophical question. And that's exactly the right result. So the sort of theory of what philosophy is that I gave just a moment ago, well, it fits with this question being a philosophical question. Okay, let me quickly consider some objections. And by objections, I mean like objections to the whole enterprise of like philosophy, like why do philosophers exist? Why do we teach these courses in college classes? Why is anyone spending any time doing this activity, right? You might be like, okay, I get what philosophy is. It's those questions, and it's trying to answer these questions rigorously, even though we don't have, the tools of observation or experimentation. We also don't have the tools of proof from stipulated definitions or axioms. I get that what philosophy is, but you might be thinking, I don't like it. I don't like philosophy, and I don't think anyone should do it. Something like that. Let me consider some objections to the whole practice. Here's the first objection. If philosophical claims are not based on observation or experimentation, or they're also not based on mathematical proofs, then anything goes, right? Then anything goes. Any answer is just as good as any other answer, right? And so it's silly. I don't think that's true. I don't think anything goes. I think that there's still a method left for answering philosophical questions, and the name of that method is arguments or reasoning, rationality. Even though we don't have the tools of observation or proof from stipulated definitions, we still have this other tool left. There's a third one, and it's giving carefully constructed, rational, logical arguments, right? So we can give arguments, and some arguments are better than other arguments. Reasoning works. So I suggest that it's not true that anything goes when it comes to answering philosophical questions. No, some of the answers are good, and some of the answers are bad. And the worst answers are worse because the arguments supporting them are less logically valid. Notice, whether anything goes is itself a philosophical question, right? Because whether anything goes is not something that we could have answered through observation or experimentation or through mathematical proof. Okay, here's one more objection to the whole practice of philosophy. Philosophy doesn't produce anything, so it's worthless. That's another objection. Okay, well, what do you mean by produce anything? right? I mean, if by produce something, we mean produce, I don't know, profits for shareholders, then yeah, but philosophy doesn't produce too many profits for shareholders. I agree with that. But philosophy does produce something. What does it produce? It produces reasoned answers to philosophical questions. That's what it produces. It just is the attempt to answer these questions in a rational, logical way. And so it produces well-reasoned answers to those questions. That's what it produces. And so then the question becomes, well, is that product, a reasoned answer to these philosophical questions, is that worth having? Is that important? And I suggest, oh, it's super worth having. It's super important. Like you desperately want it, right? Right? The issue is whether getting those answers is worthwhile. Whether getting those answers is worthwhile depends on whether the particular questions are important, right? Does God exist? Is that an important question? Do I have an immortal soul? That is, I mean, here's this, let's talk about this question for a second. I say this to my, introduction to philosophy students on the first day when I'm giving this talk. I say, look, consider this question. Do I have an immortal soul? By soul, I just mean something like your mind, your consciousness, your thoughts, your personality, and so forth. Not your arms and legs, but your thoughts, your beliefs and desires, and so forth. Does that continue to exist after your body dies, after your heart stops beating and the neurons in your brain stop firing and so forth, right? Okay, that's the question. That is a pretty important question. Like I say this to the students on the first day, you're desperate for an answer to that question. If you're not desperate for an answer to that question, then you don't know what you're desperate for. Because don't you want to know whether you're immortal or not? Because of course, if your mind continues to live on after your body dies, if it moves somewhere, right? Then of course you live forever, right? You are your mind, you're your thoughts. You might lose your body, of course, but you live forever. But of course, if your mind ceases to exist, if your consciousness puffs out of existence, if your personality is gone, well, then you're gone. Okay, so the difference there is between whether a person can really and truly die or whether they live forever. The difference is hugely important, and I suggest everybody wants to know the answer to which one is which. Which is it? Do I live forever or do I cease to exist? So anyway, I think that philosophy is not worthless. I think that philosophy is extremely valuable because it produces reasoned answers to philosophical questions, and those are absurdly desirable. Oh, notice one other thing. This question, whether philosophy is worthless, that is also itself a philosophical question, right? Can't answer that question with observation or with mathematical proof. It's a question of value. It's a question of what's worthwhile. All right, anyway, one result of this is that one result of the fact that answering philosophical questions can't happen by way of observation or experimentation or by mathematical proof is that philosophy is hard. Like it's super hard to answer these questions because we have limited tools, and doing anything with limited tools is hard, right? You try to build a house with just one screwdriver, that's going to be harder than building it with power tools, And because we're doing something that's hard, philosophy students end up being very smart. Or I don't know if they're so smart, but they do really well on standardized tests. This is the talk. This is part of the talk. This is especially designed for my first year students when they on the first day of class. This is to justify to their parents that they're taking a philosophy course. There's this test, this standardized test called the Gmat. It's for business school. You have to take it before you get an MBA. These are the average Gmat scores by major. Physicists, students who study physics, do the best, but then philosophers do the fourth best. Philosophy students, philosophy majors, get better scores on the business school exam than economics majors. Yeah, that's because our questions are hard. Then there's the Lsat. This one's too easy for philosophy majors because the Lsat is the standardized test you have to take before you go to law school. And it's just logic. And philosophy just does logic. I mean, logic is a subfield of philosophy. There's the person in the office next to me is our logician in the philosophy department. She teaches logic courses. And so if you study logic, you're just going to be good at the Lsat. And that's what happens is that philosophy majors are the best at the Lsat. They get the best scores on this standardized test. Then there's the GRE. It stands for the Graduate Requisite Exam. This is the standardized test that one has to take before going to like any sort of generic graduate school. If you want to go to graduate school in biology or history or sociology or geology, then you have to take the GRE. It's like the SATs, but again. And if you take the composite score, that is, you add up the verbal section, the quantitative section, and the writing section, you get a composite score. And I'm going to put up the chart for the composite scores, and it's going to look fake. Like it's going to look like this can't be real. Like this can't be the real thing, but it is the real thing. It's wild. These are the composite scores. Look at how far ahead the philosophy majors are than the next three: English, political science, and physics and astronomy, right? The philosophy majors do way better than everyone else on this standardized test score, which is bonkers. But anyway, that's how it is. They also apparently make a lot of money. Not me, of course. I'm a college professor. I don't make a lot of money, but the philosophers, the philosophy majors who go into all sorts of other things, they make more money over the course of their lifetime than all of the other non-STEM majors. And by STEM, we mean science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So other than those fields, they make more money than business economics students or marketing students or political science students or students who study English literature or hotel management or business administration. Anyway, wild. Okay, so here's a question. Okay, is that why one should study philosophy? You have to imagine I'm giving this talk to the students who take a philosophy class for the first time here at UNCG, right? Is that a good reason to study philosophy, to become smart or to become rich? Well, that is also a philosophical question, right? The question of what one should study and what one's reasons for studying it should be, those are all questions that you can't answer by observation or experimentation, and they're not questions that you can answer by mathematical proof. They are themselves philosophical questions. The end. That's my talk, folks. If you have any questions, please ask them. We can talk about anything that I said just now, or really anything else.
That last slide really made me smile, Jeff. I love that. Well, while we give our attendees a chance to put some questions in the chat, I had a couple that I received ahead of time, so I'll take the liberty of asking you. And this works in perfectly with what you just ended with. And it says you talk about the many benefits of a philosophy major, and the overall benefits of liberal arts would all fall into that. So do you feel that liberal arts are alive and well at UNCG?
Yes. I don't know if this is too inside baseball, folks, but the philosophy department in particular, not every philosophy department has the kinds of resources we have at UNCG, right? So I'll give you an example. NC State. NC State is a research-intensive university here in the UNC system. They don't have a standalone philosophy department. They combine philosophy with religious studies or something else. They have less resources to teach excellent philosophy classes and that sort of thing, and do excellent philosophy research than we have here at UNCG. We have our own dedicated philosophy department. We have a whole bunch of tenure track faculty. We hold a whole bunch of excellent, brilliant lecturers in the philosophy department. So we have a sort of a surprising amount of resources for the kind of regional public university that we are. And so we're doing great stuff. My philosophy courses are full, and so I'm feeling pretty alive and well.
I can see why they're full though, Jeff. So I'm looking at the attendees. We don't have anything in the chat yet. I still do have a couple more questions that we're sending ahead, but I know Alice Irby's there and I know Agnes Price, and you all are never shy. So if you don't feel like putting something in the chat, just to hit Q&A and we'll unmute you as well. There we go. Alice wants to ask, Alice, thank you. What attracted you to UNCG? Oh,
well, so I'm thrilled to be living in Greensboro and teaching at UNCG. I'll tell you what, your question makes it sound like I had all these options. Let me tell you, folks, there are not a lot of jobs like this. A tenure track faculty position at an excellent university like UNCG, I won the lottery to get this job, right? So, there was another job that I could have taken alternative to this one, and I wanted to be in a place where my wife and I could afford to buy a house, and and we have 2 young kids, and there were good public schools and that sort of thing. And there were great colleagues here at UNCG. And then also it was sort of attractive because UNCG was teaching a lot of first generation college students and was sort of doing great stuff. And so I liked all of those things about UNCG. But the job that I've got, I get to teach philosophy all day. I get to research philosophy. I have a stable job. It's a tenure track position that I'm in. These jobs are impossible to get. If you get one, you've won the lottery. You've hit the jackpot. And so, yeah, that's what I did. It's going great.
That's a great answer, Jeff. I'm glad to know that you're so happy to be here. We're happy to have you and privileged to have you. Felix Brawen wants to know, it gives a lot of life generation wider field of a job. So I think she's speaking to philosophy in general, correct?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just think, here's the thing. Here's what I'll say about this. There aren't that many skills, like academic skills, cognitive skills. There just aren't that many. How many are there? What are the skills? There's writing clearly, speaking clearly. There's being able to understand written text. There's being able to understand numbers and work with numbers and quantities and that sort of thing, right? There's not that many more than that. If you can do all of that stuff, then you can do jobs in a whole variety of fields, right? I mean, today in the workplace, in almost any white collar job, you are writing emails and reading emails all the time. And that's not the way it was. Like when I was a kid, like maybe this is just from television or my parents' jobs, but one got the sense that in the 90s, everything was like on the phone. These like stockbrokers are on the phone. They're like picking up all these phones. It's talking. Now writing is massively more important in a way because of the dominance of email, right? In every field, people are writing and reading emails all the time. If you can write clearly and read something and understand it and think about it with precision, you're like way ahead of the game. And so because there's just not that many skills, there's writing, there's reading, there's using quantities and doing mathematical things, right? There's expressing yourself clearly when speaking. If you've got that stuff, that's the sort of stuff that we do in the philosophy classroom. If you've got that stuff, you can just do anything. And anyway, that's my thought on that.
Amen to that. Allison Mims, class of 65, says your definition of philosophy was most helpful. I took philosophy in fall 1963. Allison, if I got your grad year wrong, I apologize. And I don't remember a thing about it. I wish I could be in your class. By the way, I saw a sign in the store with a picture of Bigfoot and the caption read, "Bigfoot believes in you."
That's an inspiring message from Bigfoot or whoever writes the copy for Bigfoot. Yeah, well, you kind of can be in my class in that I have all these, my lectures are available for free on YouTube, on the internet. All of my undergraduate lectures that I made for my philosophy classes, the online classes, especially during the height of the pandemic and that sort of thing, they're up on YouTube and they are available for free for anyone in the world to watch. And they watch them. I get an email. The amazing thing about, you put your video lectures on the internet. The amazing thing is that people watch them all over the world and I get emails. Like I probably get an email every 3 or 4 days. I get one every 3 or 4 days from someone somewhere in the world, from Australia or India or Russia or Argentina or somewhere. And someone just says, "Hey, I watched your video about this. It was super helpful." Or "I'm a law student and I didn't understand this, but you explained the thing that I searched for on the internet." And I just get these like lovely emails from people all over the world. Anyway, so you can be in my class if you want.
Yeah, just Google Jeff Kaplan and they'll pop up.
If you
and
Google,
just a reminder too, after this, we will send everybody that registered a recording of this video so you can look it up. And there is one. Can you see the chat, Jeff?
yes.
Can you see the one from Marcia Driscoll?
Sorry, you want me to read
Yeah,
it?
no, you go ahead because I think you'll better understand it if you read it.
What do you think the Scottish common sense, existentialism, or pragmatism philosophers would say to your description of philosophical questions or those that cannot be answered by methods of empiricism or mathematical proofs? Do they not imply that those kinds of unanswerable questions, good, should simply be set aside until they can be answered empirically? Yes, excellent. Okay, so there's a whole, the answer is, oh yes, they would disagree with me. They think I'm terrible. these folks. So there's a school of thought from various fields in philosophy and times in history that thinks the following. I think this is what Marcia's getting at. There's a school of thought that says only empirical sentences, claims, or correspondingly questions as well, only empirically testable claims or mathematically provable claims can be answered. And not only can those questions be answered, only those questions and only those statements are sensible. Only those questions and only those statements are coherent, right? This is the big broad category. The name for this, Marcia doesn't mention it, but she mentions a whole bunch of other fields of philosophy that are sort of similar to it or fall within it. The broad name for this is logical empiricism, or sometimes called logical positivism, right? So, or the Vienna Circle. Okay, these folks thought that they were very impressed by science. They thought science was great, which it is. And they were thinking, okay, if a question is testable, if you can test through experimentation to figure out the answer to a question, that's a good question. That's a question that makes sense. But if there's no way to test it empirically, and if there's also no way to prove the answer mathematically, then that question, not only is that question unanswerable, that question doesn't even make sense. That question isn't even a question, they thought. I have a whole lecture on this on my YouTube page about A.J. Ayer. If you search for, I don't know what it's called, but A.J. Ayer is the name of the philosopher, A-Y-E-R. He was a leading figure in this school of thought. Yes, they disagree with me. They think that all of the non-empirically testable questions are not even questions. They're not even coherent questions. Now, would you like, I'll take just 20 seconds to prove their whole school of thought wrong. Should I do it? Okay, now I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to claim that I came up with this. Every philosophy professor knows this. We all now know that they're wrong. Okay, but here's their central claim. Ready? Their central claim that is this: if a statement cannot be proven empirically or mathematically, then it's nonsense. Okay, that's their claim, right? If a statement cannot be proven empirically or mathematically, then that statement is nonsense. Okay, here's the question. Ready? Is that statement, can that one be proven empirically or mathematically? The statement, if a statement cannot be proven empirically or mathematically, then it is nonsense, right? That statement, the statement that is the thesis of their whole school of thought, is that statement the kind of statement that can be proven empirically or mathematically? The answer is it can't be proven in either way. The very thesis of logical positivism itself fails its own test. The other name for this school of thought is verificationism. Does that make sense, right? I mean, think about it, right? The idea that some sentences are like any sentence of that kind is nonsense. Well, you can't observe all the sentences, right? You can't answer that question by observation. And it's not a mathematical question. You couldn't run some calculation. So verificationism, that theory, disproves itself. I didn't come up with that. That's I don't know who came up with that, but everybody knows it. There you go.
Well, you got a brilliant response in the chat from Glenda. But I have two more questions, and there's a long one. And see if she credits philosophy for her granddaughter's success. Oh, wonderful. And Women's College Honors Program. So thank you so much for that. And I think that is really just kudos to UNCG and the experience, more so than a question specifically for you, Jeff. And just reiterating that the study of philosophy is important for those in all sectors of society. So we'll have two more questions, and then it's probably about time for us to wrap up. We could go on and on. This is fascinating. This is one that came in earlier, and it's really asking you how you feel today. What do you feel the biggest struggle is for students being taught online? And as a professor, do you feel isolated from your students?
Yeah, so online courses. So we teach a whole bunch of online courses in the philosophy department. And my opinion is online courses are good, but they're not as good as in-person courses. I just think they're not as good. They have an enormous benefit. The enormous benefit is that students can take them while they're, you know, non-traditional college students who have children and who work full-time jobs, right, can take those courses in what used to be, it used to be that they would take evening courses, right? But it's much harder to take an evening course, right? Like it used to be that there would, you know, you have this image of a college classroom in the 90s or whatever, and they turn on the lights at 8 p.m. and then you have college at 8 p.m. from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. or whatever, right? And that's how you'd earn a degree while working full time. The problem is, of course, you can't put your kid to bed when they're 4 and then go and leave, unless you have someone else home with the kid, and then go and leave and spend, you know, several hours in a college classroom, right? But you can put your kid to bed when they're 4 years old and then go. I mean, it's exhausted and you're probably exhausted already from the whole day, but and then go and log into your computer and take an online course for 2 hours in the evening, right? Before you pass out yourself. So I think there's enormous advantages to online courses. I teach several of them, but I just think they're not as good. One of the underappreciated reasons that I think they're not as good, one of the challenges, this is to answer what are the challenges that face students taking online courses? The challenges, I think one of the big challenges is like a feeling of community that generates motivation, right? I have a student who was an excellent student in a philosophy of law course that I taught in 2019. This was an in-person philosophy of law course. This student, he did all the readings. He came to class. He raised his hands. He made excellent points. He got an A-. Great. That's good. That's a good grade in my class. Okay, to get an A-, right? He was a good student. What happened was, then COVID hit and all of his courses moved online. He's isolated, living in his dorm room or wherever he's living, or an apartment somewhere. I don't know where he was living, but the point is the motivation is hard to keep up if you don't have people around, if you're not, you know, standing next to people, right? Sitting next to people, physical people in a physical room. So just one of the enormous challenges for online courses is, you know, when you have a physical classroom that you're supposed to go to at a certain time of day, you feel like you need to be there partly because there's other people who are going to be there and they're going to see whether you're there or not. That's how it works for me. I schedule a meeting of any kind, and then what happens before the meeting is I don't want to go. I never want to go. I don't want to go to meetings. I don't want to do anything. But then it's on my calendar and these people are there and they're expecting me to be here and I gotta go, you know? But in an online course where either you don't have to be anywhere at any particular time, or even if you do have to be in a Zoom room, no one's going to notice if you're not there. It just becomes harder to get the motivation to do the reading in advance and show up and work as hard. So a huge barrier, and I do not have the solution for this.
Yeah.
With online courses.
It's a hard one, isn't it? That's a hard one. Well, we have several, but we'll get to the last one as we run out of time here. I think this is a nice one to end with. Have your kids expanded the philosophical questions that you consider?
Oh, an excellent question. An excellent question. Now I'm struggling. I need an example. Good philosophical question that my kids asked. I mean, they ask really good questions. Many of them philosophical. Then, of course, I explain to them that it's a philosophical question and how you could try to answer it. And then they immediately regret asking the question. And they say, I don't want it. Now I don't want to lecture or whatever. I asked a simple question. I mean, here's a non-philosophical question that my daughter, who is now 4.5, she probably asked this when she was 3. This is not a philosophical question. It's just the one that popped into my head. That's the question that she asked. She asked, why is the earth this big? That's the question. Why is the earth this big? That's a good question. I did not immediately know the answer to this question. So then I had to figure out what the answer is. And it's actually, when you think about it, it's not totally obvious, but astronomers and astrophysicists, they know the answer. Why is the earth as big as it is? I had to look this up. We had to figure it out. And then I told her, and she had mostly lost interest by then, but I was excited to figure it out. Okay, I'm going to tell you the answer that I figured out. It's not that complicated. Here's why the earth is the size that it is. All of the planets formed. This has nothing to do with philosophy. All of the planets formed about 4.5 billion years ago, when, roughly the same time, a little bit after when the sun formed. The sun formed about 4.5 billion years ago, and the sun and all the planets there's all this dust in this area, And the dust, the particles, the molecules, the atoms out in space just sort of, where they're all attracted to each other by gravity, and they just form together into the sun. And then there was a little bit of leftover stuff in this region next to our sun. And what happened was all of the debris, all of the dust that was a certain distance from the sun came together and formed each planet, right? And so the reason that, why is Jupiter way bigger than the Earth, and why is the Earth as big as it is and Mars is a little bit smaller than the Earth? Why are the planets exactly the size that they are? They're the size that they are because that's how much debris, that's how much dust there was that far from the sun. The Earth sort of swept around in its orbit and collected all the stuff in that area. So all of the particles that make up the planet Earth, all the molecules that are in the trees and the air and the dirt in the ground and the iron in the core and so forth, all of these atoms, these are the atoms that happen to be this far from the sun at that time. That's why the planet is as big as it is. So that's something I didn't know. I had to figure that out to answer your question.
So as always, our children teach us something, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, the hour has flown by, and we are so grateful for your time today. And I think many of us are thankful that we could just listen and learn without the worry of what our grade might be, especially since an A- in your class is really great. So again, as a reminder, this session is recorded, and we encourage you to share it with your friends and those that were unable to join us today at this specific time. That's the beauty of that. And as we conclude our time together, I want to remind you of our next Vanguard virtual series that will take place on Tuesday, November 8th. And our guest speaker will be Elizabeth Hudson, class of '85, editor-in-chief of Our State magazine. And I can assure you that Elizabeth will bring to us a wonderful topic. We talked about it the other day. She's still working on some things, but complete with her unique perspective on North Carolina and the people who live here. So I hope you will plan on joining us then. Jeff, thank you. We cannot thank you enough for teaching us today. And we are all richer for having you at UNCG. Thank you. And all of you take care, and let's all stay in touch. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Our pleasure.